You ever feel like you're speaking a completely different language than the person right next to you?
Oh, all the time.
Like you're both looking at the same, I don't know, painting, but seeing totally different things.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into some really fascinating ideas from Carl Jung that might just explain why.
Hmm.
We're doing a deep dive into his concept of psychological types. And seriously, this isn't your dusty old psychology textbook.
No, not at all.
Think of it more like unlocking a secret code, you know,
Mm,
to understanding yourself and maybe even more importantly, that colleague or family member who just makes you scratch your head sometimes.
exactly. And we've sort of wrestled with Jung's work so you don't have to. We've pulled out 4 key insights specifically for you, the curious learner.
Right.
We get it. Dipping into these theories can sometimes feel like trying to read ancient hieroglyphics or something.
Totally.
But our mission here is really just to make it clear, engaging, and honestly, maybe even a little bit fun.
We can hope.
We're aiming for those aha moments, but without the overwhelm. The goal is basically to give you a shortcut to grasping Jung's core ideas about these types and how they impact, well, everything, your inner world, how you interact with others.
So Jung kicks things off with this big fork in the road, right?
Yeah.
He outlines 2 fundamental ways we tend to direct our mental energy,
Mm-hmm.
introversion and extroversion.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably heard these terms. Everyone sort of throws them around. Think of like the person energized by a quiet night in versus the one who just thrives in a crowded party.
Yeah, the classic examples.
Jung saw these as the main directions of what he called, and this sounds a bit technical, but stick with us, libido movement.
Right. Just think of it as where your general interest, your energy naturally flows, outward or inward.
Okay.
And it's really important to get that these aren't just superficial personality quirks. It's not like preferring coffee over tea.
No.
Jung argued these are deep-seated, typical attitudes, and they're surprisingly universal. They pop up everywhere. Different social classes, genders. It seems almost randomly distributed.
You mean like you could have siblings in the same family who are polar opposites?
Absolutely. You definitely see that. Makes you wonder about those family dinners, doesn't it?
It really does. Which kind of leads to the question, what happens if someone's natural tendency gets, well, pushed too hard the other way by parents or school or whatever?
Yeah, Jung had some interesting thoughts there. He suggested that if external pressures force you into an attitude that doesn't really fit your nature, he called it falsification of type.
Okay.
It could actually contribute to feeling a bit, neurotic or just off later in life. Finding your natural groove, he thought, is pretty vital for your well-being.
That makes sense.
He sets it all up so well right at the beginning of chapter 10.
Okay.
He says, let me find it. Yeah. In the following pages, I shall attempt a general description of the types, and my first concern must be with the 2 general types I have termed introverted and extroverted.
Simple enough. Sets the scene.
Exactly. So let's dive into insight number 1. What is this fundamental difference, really?
All right. Insight 1. The core distinction. Extroversion basically is like having your antenna tuned to the outside world, the realm of tangible facts, objective happenings, what people are doing.
Outward focus.
While introversion is more like having this powerful internal radar, it's focused on your own subjective experience, your thoughts, your feelings, your unique way of making sense of it all.
Yeah. Think about, say, walking down the street and it starts pouring rain.
Right.
An extroverted person might immediately think, oh, great, I'm getting wet, focusing on the objective fact of the rain.
Right. Practical.
An introverted person, though, might first notice how the rain makes them feel. Maybe it's calming, maybe it's gloomy. Their internal reaction takes center stage first, or like with music. Perfect example. An extrovert might love a song because it's, number one, everyone's talking about it, the objective success matters. The introvert, they probably need to connect with it personally. The melody, the lyrics, does it resonate with them? Its popularity is kind of secondary.
Gotcha. So for the extrovert, what's happening out there, the objective stuff tends to carry more weight in shaping their thoughts, feelings, actions. Jung said their entire consciousness looks outwards.
Exactly. They're engaged with the world.
Whereas for the introvert, there's usually this crucial internal step, right, a subjective view that slots in between perception and action.
Precisely. Their inner interpretation, that personal filter, becomes the decisive thing. They select the subjective determinants as the decisive ones.
So two people can see the exact same thing.
Right.
But their innate introverted or extroverted leaning means they process it completely differently.
It's like they're running the same data through totally different internal software. The psychic assimilation, as Jung put it, is different.
It's easy just to think, oh, well, everyone's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just individual quirks.
Yeah, that's the initial reaction. But Jung saw this pattern. He realized these were widespread typical attitudes, something much more fundamental. And here's where it gets even more layered. Jung talked about a compensatory relationship between our conscious attitude, introverted or extroverted, and our unconscious.
Compensatory, like balancing out.
Exactly, like a seesaw. If you consciously lean way too far one way, your unconscious often tries to balance it by leaning the other way.
Okay.
So someone who's super, super extroverted on the surface might actually have a pretty strong egocentric or introverted tendency bubbling away in their unconscious. It's the psyche trying to keep things stable, basically.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move to insight number 2 then. Let's focus on the extroverted attitude. What are its patterns and maybe some potential pitfalls?
Right. So we know extroverts are naturally drawn to what's happening externally. Their attention follows objective events, other people, and their actions are often guided by those outside influences.
And their sense of morality, their right and wrong, often lines up with what society expects.
Yeah, the generally valid moral viewpoint, as Jung called it. It makes sense, right? If your focus is outward, fitting in, adhering to the accepted standards is often pretty important.
But here's where it gets really interesting. You mentioned this distinction Jung made, adjustment versus adaptation.
Yes, this is key. Extroverts are usually great at adjusting, fitting into the current situation, going with the flow, reading the room.
Okay.
But true adaptation, Jung argued, needs more. It needs you to consider deeper, more universal principles, and also those subjective needs, the inner stuff. And that can be a blind spot for a very strong extrovert.
Why is that a danger?
Because the risk, as Jung saw it, is getting so caught up in objects, wholly losing themselves in their toil.
Like the hamster on the wheel analogy you used before.
Exactly. Completely focused on the running, the doing, the external, but losing sight of their inner state, their own needs. And this, he thought, can lead to functional issues, nervous problems, or even actual physical illnesses as the psyche basically yells, stop.
Whoa. He gave some pretty vivid examples, didn't he?
He really did. Like a famous singer, totally caught up in their career, pushing too hard, who suddenly loses their high notes. Not physically, but because of a nervous inhibition.
Wow.
Or a really driven businessman who achieves huge success, but then gets hit with psychogenic mountain sickness, basically. Anxiety manifesting physically that forces him to slow down.
It's like the body forcing a pause.
Precisely. Or even someone about to marry a partner who isn't quite right, maybe someone they've idealized based on external factors, who then develops esophageal spasms that physically stop them eating or symbolically swallowing the situation.
Yikes. Talk about your body saying nope, loud and clear.
It really is. And don't forget, the entrepreneur who pours everything into the business works constantly and then develops these nervous attacks of thirst that spiral into alcoholism.
Right.
It shows how the psyche tries desperately to regain balance when that conscious, extroverted drive goes too far.
And Jung linked hysteria more often with extroverts too.
Yeah, he saw it as characterized by this almost exaggerated need for connection, maybe imitating others, constantly needing external validation, being very suggestible, like their inner compass gets totally dependent on signals from the outside.
Okay, so what's happening underneath all this? In the unconscious.
Well, this is where that compensation idea comes back. Jung believed the unconscious of the extrovert often takes on a definitely introverting character.
So the opposite.
Right. All that energy consciously pushed outward, it gets sort of dammed up and funneled inward unconsciously, focusing on those neglected subjective needs and desires. But because it's unconscious, it can come out in weird ways.
Like what?
Like a kind of hidden egocentricity or even childlike infantile or really primitive archaic tendencies bubbling up.
He had that story about the printer, didn't he?
Ah, yes, the printer. Perfect illustration. This guy dedicates his entire life, all his energy to his printing business. Total external focus. So his psyche compensates. Childhood memories of loving painting resurface. But instead of taking up painting as a healthy, separate hobby,
Oh, no.
he tries to force his artistic whims onto his business, starts making terrible, impractical decisions based on these infantile artistic ideas, and it ends disastrously.
Wow.
It's a powerful example of how those Neglected, subjective, infantile claims, as Jung put it, can erupt in unhelpful ways if that inner world is ignored for too long. Makes you think, doesn't it? Are we all kind of balancing that inner printer somehow?
It really does. It's a good prompt, actually. Maybe think about areas in your life where you might be too focused on external demands, maybe at the expense of what you actually need or want inside.
Something to chew on, definitely.
Okay, let's flip the coin. Let's pivot inward with insight number 3.
Yeah.
The introverted attitude and its fascinating inner world.
Right. So Jung emphasizes that while introverted consciousness definitely sees the external world, its primary focus, its main point of reference is those subjective determinants, what's happening inside.
So the introvert relies more on what the outside thing sparks within them, the internal reaction.
Exactly. It's not about ignoring the object or the situation, but about how it's filtered and processed through their unique internal landscape. That internal resonance is key.
Now, Jung seemed quite keen to defend introversion against some negative labels, right? Things like philautic.
Yeah, philautic, which means self-loving or just egocentric, egoistic. He pushes back against those.
Why?
Well, he argues, look, all perception has a subjective element. You can't completely remove yourself, your internal viewpoint, from how you see things. It's impossible.
True.
And he makes this really crucial point that this subjective factor isn't just some minor detail. It's a world-determining power. It's just as real and fundamental as the external object. You can't just discount it or pathologize it.
And there's always a but with Jung, it seems.
Usually.
Getting too focused inward isn't ideal either.
No. An excessive development of the introverted view can lead to what he called an artificial subjectification of consciousness, like getting totally lost in your own internal world, maybe losing touch with objective reality. And the psyche, always seeking balance, might then compensate with a desubjectification of consciousness, which weirdly can look like an exaggerated, almost forced extroverted attitude.
Wow, talk about an overcorrection.
It really is. And here's another fascinating twist. If the ego, the conscious I, in an introvert, tries to completely dominate and control that inner subjective world, the unconscious can actually overcompensate by massively strengthening the influence of the external world, the object.
How does that work?
It can lead to this unconditional and irrepressible tie to the object, almost like becoming unconsciously obsessed with or dependent on the very external things the introvert might consciously be trying to remain independent from.
So their efforts to be totally self-reliant inwardly can ironically lead to a kind of external entanglement.
Precisely. A slavery of objective facts, as Jung put it. It can cause all sorts of personal struggles. It's another powerful reminder that balance between inner and outer is really the name of the game.
And did he associate a particular neurosis with introversion, like he did with hysteria and extroversion?
Yes, he mentioned psychoasthenia, more typically. It's characterized by things like extreme sensitivity, fatigue, a liability to exhaustion, feeling easily drained, especially by external demands.
That sounds like it might resonate with a lot of people who identify as introverted, that need to recharge alone.
I think so. It captures that feeling of the outer world being potentially overwhelming or depleting sometimes.
So for listeners, maybe the question is, do you find yourself nodding along to this idea of a rich inner world being your primary driver?
Yeah.
Something to reflect on.
Definitely. Okay, should we move on to our final insight number 4?
Let's do it. This is about how our preferred ways of functioning, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, play out differently depending on whether we lean introverted or extroverted.
Exactly. Jung introduces this idea of function types. Basically, one of these 4 mental tools, thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition, tends to be our lead function for adapting to the world.
Our go-to tool.
Our go-to tool. And the way we use that tool is heavily colored by our overall attitude, introverted or extroverted.
Okay, so how does that look for an extrovert?
Well, in the extroverted attitude, thinking is directed by external facts, objective data, maybe established formulas. Feeling aligns with generally accepted social values, what's considered appropriate externally. Sensation focuses on the direct, objective experience of the senses, what you literally see, hear, touch. And intuition looks for possibilities out there in the objective situation. It's all very outward-facing.
So extroverted thinking might be like making decisions based on clear external rules or widely accepted logical steps.
Yeah, applying external logic to the world around you, building bridges based on proven physics, for example.
Got it. Now contrast that with introverted thinking.
Introverted thinking is driven more by that internal subjective factor. It's less about just applying logic to facts and more about developing personal insights, digging deep into ideas, formulating unique theories, understanding the underlying principles from within. It's the aha moment happening internally.
Okay, what about feeling?
Introverted feeling is guided by deep inner values and emotions. It might not be splashed all over the surface like extroverted feeling sometimes is. It seeks inner harmony, intensity, a quiet sense of conviction about what feels right subjectively.
Less demonstrative, perhaps.
Often, yes. Then introverted sensation isn't just about the raw sensory data, but about the individual's unique internal reaction to that data. How does this color blue feel to me? What subjective image or meaning does this sound evoke? It's a very personal sensory world.
Right. And finally, introverted intuition.
That's directed towards the inner world, the unconscious images, archetypes, symbols, future possibilities bubbling up from within. It's less concerned with the concrete external situation and more with those internal hunches, visions, the gut feeling about the deeper meaning or potential.
Fascinating. So the function is the same tool, but the attitude directs where it points inwards or outwards.
You got it.
Ah.
And Jung adds another layer. The functions that aren't our dominant one, he called them the inferior functions, tend to be less developed, more primitive, more unconscious.
The ones we're not so good at using.
Kind of, and they often have the opposite attitude of our main function. So an introverted thinker might have a rather unconscious, extroverted feeling function that bursts out sometimes. This creates interesting internal dynamics, maybe even contributes to neuroses. He described our main superior function as how we consciously are, our personality, while the inferior functions are more like things that just happen to us.
Your psychological shadow side, almost.
In a way, yes, less under conscious control.
Okay, wow. So, to try and wrap up our deep dive into Jung's psychological types, we've covered quite a bit.
We have.
We look at that fundamental difference. Introversion versus extroversion, that inward or outward flow of energy. Then we explore the extroverted attitude, engaging with the world, but maybe risking losing touch with the inner self.
Right, the pitfalls.
Then we journeyed into the introverted attitude, its rich inner world, but also its unique challenges with the objective world.
The balancing act.
And finally, how these attitudes fundamentally shape how we use our main mental tools, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Phew! Quite a trip.
It really is, but hopefully understanding these basic types can be, well, a bit of a game changer.
How so?
It can bring so much more self-awareness, recognizing your own natural leanings. And maybe even more importantly, cultivating more empathy for people who just seem to operate on a completely different wavelength.
Like getting a user manual for the human psyche, as you said earlier.
Something like that.
And it's crucial to remember, right? There's absolutely no better or worse here. Introversion, extroversion, both are perfectly normal, natural ways of being.
Absolutely. Each has strengths, each has potential weaknesses. The real power comes from understanding and appreciating these differences in ourselves and in others.
Builds bridges, maybe.
Hopefully.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to take away. Considering all this, what's maybe one small observation you could make this week about yourself or someone you interact with? Just noticing perhaps a tendency towards that inner world or that outer world focus.
Yeah, just notice how might that simple awareness shift your perspective, even slightly? Or improve an interaction. Maybe that quiet person at work isn't being unfriendly.
Right. Maybe they're just deep in their introverted process, recharging their batteries.
Exactly. It's all about gaining a deeper appreciation for just how incredibly diverse human experience really is.
Well said. And look, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we definitely encourage you to explore Jung's work more. There's so much more depth there.
Oh, for sure. You might discover even more about your own unique psychological makeup, maybe even which function type feels most like you.
Definitely food for thought. Until our next exploration, keep that curiosity alive.